Diversity, equity, and inclusion, otherwise known as DEI, has been a hot topic in every type of business and academic institution for nearly a decade. DEI is the philosophy that every member of a community should have the opportunity to thrive, and that diversity is key to a community flourishing, excelling, and advancing knowledge in any and all environments.
Welcome to the Leaders Perspective Podcast. Where we talk to triple threat leaders about the people, products, trends, and experiences that influence business. I'm now pleased to introduce your host, Jason Goldberg.
I am so incredibly excited to welcome everybody to our first episode of The Leader's Perspective. This is an idea that I've had for a while, and I'm thrilled to be able to see this come to life. I've had the privilege in my career to work with some incredible leaders, and if you listen to the intro podcast, you'll remember that we focus on triple threat leaders. A triple threat leader is one who embodies the very best of leadership and who has strong IQ, EQ, and DQ, intelligence quotient, emotional quotient, and decency quotient. And with that, I'm elated to welcome our very first guest, Dion Harrison. Dion is the Chief Diversity Officer and Vice President of Business Development at Elevate Credit, a lending fintech based in Dallas. He's been with Elevate for 10 years. He's also the co-founder of a philanthropic organization called That's Just Good. He's a member of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce, and he's the chair of the DEI Committee of the National Association of Black Compliance and Risk Management Professionals. He's had an amazing career in financial services, having also worked for Citi, Wells Fargo, Urban Bank Trust, and RLJ companies. He's one of the most prolific volunteers for the Tango Tab charity fighting against hunger in the DFW area. And if that's not enough, he is the dad of one amazing daughter. So thank you for being my first guest, and welcome to The Leader's Perspective.
Yeah, no problem. That's thank you, Jason, for that. The 9-year-old is probably my favorite thing that I've been able to do. So
yes, she I'm sure she keeps you busy.
She does. She definitely does.
So I think we met, feels like 7-8 years ago now at this point.
Yeah, we did.
And so the audience has some perspective. Dion hired me a few times over in my career. So when I was a consultant, I consulted to Dion and one of his employers. He was gracious enough to bring me back a few times. And then when there was a job opportunity at that company, he hopped on the chance to recommend me and bring me on board. And then we had the opportunity. I had the privilege to work with Dion for the next few years after that. So it's been a while.
Yeah, you're very humble about that, but I had so much confidence in you, Jason, that I recommended to bring you in so that I could work for you. So that's. But
we had a good time, and
we have.
And I think when I talk in the intros about people and passion, that team that we had, for those few years are one of the highlights of my career.
I would agree with that, and I think it. I've always had obviously a passion for DEI, but the people that I work with, I think I've used some of those same principles in being humble about who I work with and where, kind of how we build our teams with each other. I think far too often people think about building teams just in the people that they hire and that they come to work for them. But honestly, I mean, the reason why I bring that up, that I recommend it to work, that I would work for you, is because you had a lot of the character, a lot of the qualities that I was looking for even in my leadership, to be quite honest with you. And I felt like we had a great rapport with one another, a great relationship in terms of us being able to collaborate with one another. And really, honestly, that's what DEI is all about. I mean, you and I have very different backgrounds. We've had some overlap in some of our career experience and whatnot, but the reality is that I think where we found commonality is in the purpose and and what we wanted to try to do for the customers that Elevate has. So yeah, I think the principles of DEI are not just something that is written on paper and put in a mission statement somewhere. It really kind of starts here and in here, and you have to allow it to kind of be real and tangible in everything that you do.
I love that. So you just jumped right in. So let's do it. How do you define DEI?
So DEI to me is a very practical thing. It's a way of you behaving every day. It's a humility that you have in terms of acknowledging who you are and what you don't know. There's a sense of self worth that comes from acknowledging who you are and being willing to share who you are. I think you have to actively do that and not shy away from it and be fearful of sharing who you are, because the reality is that nobody grows, nobody becomes. We don't, as a community, don't become more tolerant and collaborative with one another if we don't know.
Right.
I mean, there may be biases that we have that we just haven't spoken out in the open to challenge them for ourselves, and also to kind of get clarification on where some of those biases come from.
Yep.
And I think we have to be a little bit more fearless and open about it. So to me, DEI gives us a vocabulary that we can use in order to substantiate that relationship and that engagement with one another.
I like that. It's interesting. I was uh, doing some research prior to this podcast, prior to the interview, and I came across a quote that I just loved. It was from the chief diversity officer at University of Michigan. It said, "Diversity is where everyone is invited to the party. Inclusion means everyone gets to contribute to the playlist, and equity means everyone has the opportunity to dance." So,
That's very true. The only
yeah,
thing that I would add to that is not only when you're dancing, I think you got to invite people to you be okay with people attempting to dance the way that you dance, and
mhm,
also show be not be shy about showing people how you dance. Because I think
I like that.
being inclusive is not just you giving up everything. It's really learning something new and making it a part of who you are and a part of
Mhm,
your culture. I think I've told you several times that my daughter, actually, we're not a Jewish family, but we actually play dreidel and we celebrate Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and we do that because we want her to be more culturally diverse and understand some of our neighbors, some of our friends, and be able
mhm.
to have some relationships with them. So sometimes it takes a little bit more of you breaking down kind of who you are and changing who you are to be more accepting and to be at least more cognizant of what other people come from.
Well, your family is by far the most culturally aware and inclusive family of any that I've ever met. And it's inspiring. But
Yeah.
that's something that's within you, right? As soon as from the earliest days that we've met, your career path wasn't DEI, wasn't diversity, equity, inclusion, but you always did that off to the side. You were always
Yeah.
interested in that. And what drove that? How did that come about? What interested you? Was there something in your childhood that sparked it?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it was absolutely my childhood. I mean, so I come from a very rural North Carolina family. We grew up basically on a farm. My heritage has a little bit of Irish in it. It has Ethiopian. It has Nigerian. It has Cherokee Indian in it. And I have a history of my family having biracial, interracial marriages all the way back to, we traced it all the way back to like the 1700s,
Hmm.
to the
Wow.
extent to where the state of Virginia didn't recognize interracial marriages until way into the 19th century.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
had family members that were interracial couples in Virginia and ended up having to move out of Virginia just to keep their family together,
To
because
survive, right?
yeah,
Because
just to
it was
survive.
not accepted. Yeah.
Exactly, it was not accepted. And the reality is that I grew up in an environment where I saw my cousins that were biracial kids, and all the like, and we all were just family. Like, I never, them being biracial was never even a discussion. They were who they were, and um, coming from that background, I will tell you, not just from an ethnicity perspective, but also from a socioeconomic perspective. My mom made $129 a week when I was a kid, all the way up through the time that I was in the eighth grade. And I remember that because I used to see her paychecks, and and I also remember when she finally got an associate's degree and went and got another job, and I think she was making roughly around $50,000 a year. I thought we were just like rich, okay? Like I was just
Yeah.
excited about being able to make that amount of money. And then I went to college and I learned that we were actually really, really poor, you know, prior to her even getting this job.
Right.
But the thing that resonated with me was the fact that I never grew up with a poor mentality. We were very self sufficient, very self reliant. I became a plumber by the time I was like 14 years old. My grandfather used to drop me off at people's houses just to, help them out with doing things. And he didn't just drop me off at another black person's house. He dropped me off at everybody's house. And sometimes, and I was a kid. I had all these different interactions, and I had the ability to kind of speak to and interact with people of all different backgrounds and everything. And so it definitely shaped my, me being willing and to engage. But then when I went into the banking industry, I think what really resonated with me, I first started my career at Citigroup, and what I found very interesting with Citigroup is that, I mean, basically 2/3 of the world's economy runs through it, and they're a
Mhm.
global company, right? So they had to shape and reshape and reimagine everything in their company in order to fit the needs of the people that were local. And as much as they tried to be as general as possible, they couldn't be. And sometimes they had to be intentional about the markets that they went into. And you know
Right.
this as well as I do. When you go into Latin markets versus European markets versus Asian markets, they're very, very different in terms of the way that you approach customers and the
Right.
products that you deliver to them. So,
And even in the U.S., right? How
oh,
you
absolutely.
interact with customers on the bayous of Louisiana is
Yeah,
dramatically different than the way you do it in San Francisco.
it totally is. And I think, I think that's part of what I feel like is very rich about the US is the ability to be forced into doing that more often
Mhm.
because we have such a culturally diverse country. We have an opportunity to engage. I think, you know, by and large, most companies try to be as general as they possibly can to avoid offending and to avoid, discriminating against folks or whatnot. But I think from the prism of DEI, it doesn't mean that you ignore the fact that you have a diverse group of folks. You can
Yep.
still deliver a credit card that functions the exact same way and has the same billing rights and so forth to customers all across the U.S. and still have be cognizant of who they are, who it is that you're actually delivering it to in your
Sure.
marketing and in the way that you talk about the merchants that they can use and so forth. So DEI has a very practical way of actually engaging customers to feel like they trust you, to feel a sense of rapport with you, to feel like you
Sure.
actually even understand them as you're being more cognizant of kind of pushing those types of things out to them.
It's such an important point because we talk all the time in the corporate world about DEI and its focus on inward, right, on employees.
Yeah.
And there's this notion of unconscious bias, which we have, right? Everyone
Yeah.
has. You have it, I have it, everyone has it. And it's in us based upon our environment and our upbringing.
Yeah.
Um, and as we build products, as we build experiences for customers, those unconscious biases, without a doubt, are embedded in those experiences. So
They absolutely are.
it's incumbent upon all of us to really become aware of what those are and try to extract those. So
Absolutely.
this is interesting because this is actually this helps me transition to something I really want to talk to you about because
Sure.
we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, chief diversity officers, which you are. Most people in that function come up through a traditional HR, human
Yeah.
resources background, right? And
Yes.
they find an opportunity, and it's more often than not, a person of color who finds an opportunity to step into a CDO function, which is terrific. You
Yeah,
came up through a different path,
yeah,
right?
very different.
Can we talk about that?
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about your career, and
Yeah.
then how you sort of moved in parallel.
Yeah, so I think the point of my career that I think was very pivotal for me from a DEI perspective is when I went to work for Robert L. Johnson in DC, who was the founder of BET,
Hmm.
and he had a portfolio company of about 15 different companies. I had always admired him as an entrepreneur himself, but also just having the opportunity to work in his company was really. I came into that company thinking to myself, that I knew everything that there was to know about credit cards because I had spent almost 10 years at Citigroup, all in
Hmm.
their cards group, and I had done a bunch of different stuff from risk modeling to compliance to being a business analyst to just any and everything that you can think of. I had a very unconventional pathway there, but it was all because I was curious and was willing to try something different. But I went to RLJ companies, and the reality was, I got to this company and they basically said, you are the credit card team, so have at it and
And,
go build this credit card.
and by the way, I don't think most of our listeners have any perspective of what RLJ is and who Bob is. Do
Yeah,
you want to give him a quick background on that? Because
yeah. So
he's
Rob,
been so incredibly influential on this country.
he has, he has. Robert L. Johnson was the founder of Black Entertainment Television, and he sold that company to Viacom. And in selling that company to Viacom, he became one of the first, the U.S. first black billionaires. He has had a long career and still continues to have a long career that he owns himself. He was even like a former lobbyist and so forth, but he has always been a serial entrepreneur, and Black Entertainment Television was really his dream of being able to allow African Americans to own their own content and
Hmm.
to be able to deliver content that was relevant to Black lifestyles, Black culture, and so forth. And even in his portfolio of companies, which consisted of a number of different things from a jazz studio to even actually having owned, he was the largest minority owner of Hilton and Marriott brand hotels for quite some time. He still owns a publicly traded REIT right now. And again, his portfolio companies spans about 15 different companies, but he himself has been a very vocal, public figure for advancing not just the opportunities for Black Americans, but also just diversity and inclusion altogether. I mean, he's a strong believer in equality for all, and he manages all of his portfolio companies in that way. He wants to be able to deliver products that are great for all people, and especially those people of color. He wants to make sure that there is an intentional market that goes directly to them and that satisfies the needs that they have. He's actually made a lot of African Americans millionaires over his lifespan, but genuinely because he cares about the products that they want to bring to market. And RLJ allowed me the opportunity to kind of create this credit card portfolio and leverage all of the different experiences that I had at Citigroup. But what I started to see with this, with this company in particular, is that I could take everything that I learned from like a Citigroup and be far more intentional about delivering it to groups that were disadvantaged, those that
Right.
have thin files because they're immigrants, or even those that are disadvantaged because of discriminatory practices that have been in the past, like redlining and things of that nature. We could deliver it to those folks. We just needed to break down some of the barriers and the biases that we had in order to deliver it to them. And
Right.
sometimes that meant taking a little bit of a risk in making sure that we could deliver it to those folks, and not necessarily because there was some data that told us that those folks were more dangerous for us, but really
Hmm.
because we just didn't know. And a lot of times credit companies have not offered these products to people of color and immigrants and so forth because of the unknown about what they think that they might get into. And then there definitely been moments where they will test a little bit, and then they come back and they find out, oh, we shouldn't have done that. But
Hmm.
quite honestly, there's a everybody that owned a credit card when they first got it didn't always manage it well, right? Especially if you weren't taught how to use it. So people of color, immigrants, all the like have to be taught how to use these products the proper way. And I think this company allowed me the opportunity to work with a lot of our vendors to say, like, let's be more intentional about how we communicate the customer journey so that we can teach them the right way. Let's lay out our expectations. And fortunately, I've been able to do the same here at Elevate, because RLJ Financial actually ended up getting acquired by Elevate, and I became part of the Elevate family as a result of that acquisition, and and I've been able to do the exact same thing through here, and
Hmm.
always advocating for looking at disadvantaged groups and trying to create different products that were focused on that, and being cognizant of how we communicate and everything.
So you've had clearly an opportunity to be in business leadership roles, product management, operations, risk, across the
Yes,
board, right?
yes,
You're a true general manager in that sense that you've played in so many different areas.
correct.
So how did chief diversity officer come to be? Because right now you serve as both chief diversity officer and in a business development role.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so it essentially came about when I, I I have worked with Elevate for quite some time. Even at RLJ, they were a client of ours, and we worked with them. So I have a very unique understanding and knowledge of all the products that Elevate has had throughout its history. And the opportunity came up for within our government affairs group to tap a business. A business person to go and advocate for Elevate, to tell our story to congressional members up in DC. And I volunteered because I felt like it was a great opportunity to really kind of tell, the story of our succession and the things that we had evolved from. The first panel that I actually spoke on, though, was it was a group called the Financial Services Innovation Council. What I didn't know at the time was that it was actually made up of an entire panel of African American panelists who all came from different walks of life in terms of the banking industry. Some were in treasury management, some were in the stock exchange, and I was the only one that was actually in in consumer finance.
Right.
Interestingly enough, whenever you talk to congressional staffers, many of them are very young folks that were in the room, and I think what I spoke about, from a consumer perspective, really resonated with them, and I hit on a lot of hard topics that hit the average American pocket, right? And I think these kids, there were a few of them that came to me after the conversation. Who was just like, I need to get my budget together, but I don't, because I didn't realize, that by doing X that this was going to happen, and so on and so forth. And I really appreciate, you're saying that. And I talked a lot about how do we be more inclusive with different groups, and that just because you've had some financial trouble doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't mean that you intended that to happen. There's just a series of different things that can happen sometimes that cause you to get into that scenario. And I think that broke down a little bit for these folks, for this audience in particular, that it was okay for them to come and talk to me, right? And so that opened the door for me to actually speak to more congressional members. In fact, that day, I think I had five more meetings that were basically, booked right after that session. And it was great conversation to actually speak to our congressional members and to their staff, and really identify that they're people just like us, and the constituents that they serve are the people that we create these products for every single day. But they just hadn't looked at things from the prism that I was speaking to sometimes. And I think because I was so willing to continue those conversations and to keep doing it, I ended up actually being, doing a testimony to the House Financial Services Committee in Congress to talk a little bit about how banks can partner with fintechs in order to broaden their ability to reach, communities of color, and to reach
Right.
those folks that are disadvantaged. And I think that that in itself, again, was building on me becoming more of an advocate for diversity for Elevate, and telling the story of how our products evolved to serve those groups, and how we could potentially enable other institutions, especially banking institutions, to serve those groups a little bit more. There's far too often in the industry, many people have said that um, people of color just don't trust banks, and I think to some degree that's true. But I also think that the larger reason that there's such hesitance and a disconnect between the relationship is because most of the banks just don't have the actual product that these customers need. And they
Right.
haven't had the ability to innovate and change those products because they've been stuck with either capital restraints or just not having or understanding the innovation that they needed in order to deliver it. And I think
Well,
what Elevate does well is really talk to customers, consumers, get their data, get their information, and translate that into actual real products.
yeah, I mean, I remember a time where the two of us had an opportunity with a group to go out, and we were,
Yeah,
feet on the street, right?
yeah,
It was like a really, really disturbing treasure hunt. Um, we were
very
given
much so.
lists of tasks of what lower income consumers would do or try to do on a daily basis, or how they would engage with the less traditional financial services system. And it was just a slap. I remember that
Yeah,
like it was yesterday. It was a slap in the face because it was just such a wake up call for me, because
yeah,
the way that some groups are exploited in the
yeah.
U.S. is pretty terrible.
Acel Advisors expert consultants are all veteran operators who bring real solutions to your business challenges. Contact us at info@acel-advisors.com to reach our experts today.
All right, we're back. So again, we're back with Dion Harrison, who is Chief Diversity Officer of Elevate Credit. Welcome back, and I just want to remind listeners to like the podcast, follow, and we're available on all of the platforms where podcasts are streaming: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. So Dion, you were talking to us about your experience with Congress, and I remember shortly after that you were tapped to shift into a or expand your role into a chief diversity officer role. So, more specifically, what's the benefit to an organization for having a chief diversity officer that comes out of the business line instead of a traditional HR path?
Yeah, so I think anyone that's willing to be in the DEI space uh, gives you a different perspective based on where they come from. I
Yeah.
think my unique kind of contribution to my organization is that I actually understand a lot about our business, and what I hope to achieve over time is to be able to change a lot of the perceptions and perspectives of our employees, to be more cognizant of the customers that we serve, to be more mindful of the communities that we serve, and to be actively engaged in doing so, and understand how they can translate those learnings, those lessons, and that level of engagement into actual better products in our financial system.
Yep.
For those
I,
folks that come from the HR perspective, I mean, I think there's still some advantage there because they understand human capital. They understand the advantages of leveraging, all of the policies, procedures, and things of that nature. But I will
mhm.
say DEI is just very different than HR, and it is because DEI really kind of deals with the reason why someone adheres to a particular policy or a particular procedure. And I'll give you an example of that. Um, the first Equal Pay Act was actually contemplated back in the 1940s. Okay. And in the 1960, I want to say it was 1963, there was an actual act that was signed that basically said that we have to pay women the same that we pay men
Mm.
for comparable jobs, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So from 1963, and then again in 65, and then again in 71, and then several times over, all the way up through 2015, there were several iterations of the exact same act that just added a little bit something extra to it to say, hey, we really have to pay women the same thing that we pay men
Wow.
for the same job. And
Mm.
all the way up until President Obama signed the Lilly Ledbetter Act, that basically just gave more rights in order to sue, right? To how to bring and gave instructions on how to bring a class action lawsuit whenever that discrimination has happened. But if you think about that, we're talking about 1940s all the way up through 2022. That's
Right.
that's years and years and
Incredible.
years of several rules,
Yeah.
laws, procedures that have been written to tell us exactly how to not do that,
And yet,
but it still happens.
yeah.
Right?
Right. Absolutely.
DEI is that X factor that gets to the heart of why someone is doing it. What is the incentive? What is the motivation? And a
Right.
lot of times it's our biases, a lot of times it's our background, our experiences. And what DEI tries to do is change all of that by making people engage with one another and be more mindful and cognizant of the differences of that we have, so that we can be more accommodating and understand that maybe those laws, those laws are good because they help to keep us accountable. But at the
Mhm.
same time, we as humans can actually self manage. We
Right.
can still be good people without without these laws being in place that keep forcing us to say and to do things. We don't need necessarily all of that, but
That's
that's where I feel like DEI is just very different. It's the intangibles that speak to our character, speaks
right.
to our integrity, and why we actually are accountable to that.
That's a great point. I want to pivot just a little bit. So
Sure.
we're now, for the last 2 years now, we've been operating in a virtual environment, largely in a virtual environment. Companies are a little bit all over the map, right? There,
Yeah.
some are back in the office, some are back part time, and a lot of them are just have embraced digital first. But
Right.
either way, we have distributed employees. Um, how has the efficacy of DEI changed now that companies are in a virtual working environment? Does it matter? Does it change at all? Does it make it more or less relevant?
Um, I think it makes it more relevant, to be quite honest with you, because we're now with this virtual environment actually able to attract people that we weren't able to attract before from other cities, from other states.
Yep.
And being more cognizant of even their environments is very different, right? Like, we're a Fort Worth based company, and we have an office in Dallas, and we're very Texas, right? we we and it's just part of our persona a little bit, that
Yeah.
we love and endear Texas, right? But the reality is that we're becoming a much more national type of a company, and the fact that we have people that work out of Seattle and California, Hawaii, and even myself in Florida.
Mhm.
We have to be cognizant of the environments that all of those folks are in order to stay engaged with them and to give them opportunities to feel like that they're not isolated just because they're working somewhere else, but
Right.
that they're engaged in the programming. So from a DEI perspective, we have had to be a little bit more creative, leveraging a lot of the tools, Zoom, Teams. We do a lot of education. We are now starting to work on our website a little bit more so that we can have better communications. We've had to think of different ways that we can interact with our employees, and even to the extent of finding community organizations that all of our remote employees can actually participate in, and giving them that opportunity. We're very fortunate to have a great relationship, and I'm on the board of Junior Achievement, and it's one of those organizations that has evolved over time. They've kind of leaned into their virtual environments themselves, and what's been great is that, because they have these virtual platforms within Junior Achievement, we've been able to have some of our employees, even our remote employees, to participate in teaching financial literacy to kids K through 12. We just recently did one for an organization called LGBTQ Saves, which works with
Okay.
at-risk LGBTQ youth that are between the ages of 13 and 20. And we were able to deliver a financial literacy class to them, where traditionally they wouldn't have been able to take advantage of that because they may not have been, in the environment in order to receive it. So I definitely think that it matters, and I think you have to lean into it a little bit more just to make sure that you're still keeping your employee base engaged.
I think that's great. All right. So, last question for you. So, obviously, I want to come full circle back to this notion of triple threat leadership. And obviously, I think you're a triple threat leader. You're obviously the first guest. Um, when it comes to triple threat leadership, right? High intelligent quotient, intelligence quotient, high emotional quotient, high decency quotient. I've always felt that it's, mostly nature, healthy dose of nurture in there, but that, being a triple threat leader isn't necessarily learned. It has to come from within. But
Yeah,
I also know that, as leaders, we grow and improve by watching and experiencing from both great and terrible leaders,
yeah.
right? We experience it from both sides. So, can you maybe share a little bit about one to two triple threat leaders who you've learned from, or even if there's a leader that's on the bad side of the spectrum who you've learned from, who you said that is not what I want to do.
Sure.
But either way, if there's somebody who's been deeply influential to you and your career, if you could just tell us about that experience, that would be great.
Yeah. So there's a few things obviously that I think really influenced me. There was a gentleman by the name of Nipsey Hussle who actually said that if you are surrounded by people that, if you have a circle of friends that aren't teaching you to be better than what you are, then you don't have really a circle of friends. You have a cage, right? And I've been very cognizant of what he meant by that. And I've been very intentional about looking for the people that I want to surround me, um, because I want people that are going to tell me when I need to do better, right?
Mhm.
Um, I need people that are going to be honest with me about what my growth looks like and where I might be faltering. And that doesn't mean those people have to be malicious or mean about it. It
Nope.
can be very constructive, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
And both ways, right? That feedback,
Absolutely.
that constructive feedback should come from above and from all around you and below.
Absolutely. And so I think part of my experience at RLJ, I was very fortunate to work with Kathy Bowden Holland, who by far is one of the most premier leaders that I've ever worked with. I mean, there were things that Kathy taught me that I still use today, even though we haven't worked with each other in a few years now. But the reality is that I appreciated her example,
Mhm.
and from the perspective that I think one of the biggest lessons that I learned from Kathy is to not be shy about who you're advocating for, and it's okay to advocate for who you are also, and to make sure that you're getting the best deal that you can possibly get out of what, but also always make that deal equitable, right? She always used to say, you get one chance to make a bad deal, and that is not a lie. You make a bad deal once, and it lives with you. No matter who else you try to have a relationship with, it'll
Right.
follow you, right? Because it follows you in terms of your own behavior. It'll follow you in terms of your reputation, and I think that she by far is one person that has always shown me how to make sure that I was being cognizant of other people's perspectives, right? Which is another DEI quality, cognizant of other people's perspectives and their incentives and what they can actually gain from the relationship, and always make it equitable, right? And then honestly, Jason, like, I learned a lot even working with you. I mean, I think when you and I worked together, I think we were. I never looked at us like a far too often we use this like Batman and Robin types, analogies or whatever, but it really wasn't like that. You created a team of equals. And I felt like everybody that we brought on, whether they work for me or whether they work for you in my peer group, or even, folks that were subordinate, we always were a team of equals. We never, and you always made sure that everybody had an equitable contribution at the table. You never made a decision without talking with the collective group, and you made sure that you were very intentional about bringing people in, even when it was a tough conversation, and you knew that, you know, either I or somebody else had an opposing view. You and I always had like a couple of different things that we were just like, I don't think that's right. But but that's it created this environment that was so much more productive. And as well as I do, we had a tiny team compared to the rest of the enterprise at Elevate. But I think that is what makes us. That is what made us very efficient, is because when you apply kind of those DEI qualities amongst each other, where you're collaborating, where you're open, where you're listening, actively listening to one another, and you're okay with talking about the tough subjects, because at the end of it, what you're really working towards is a common goal and finding commonality amongst one another and trying it, right? Trying something and then figuring out how you feel about it, and then course correcting over time. So quite honestly, I think that those types of environments, the one that you created, and also the mentorship and partnership that I had with Kathy Bowden Holland, are two that have really kind of catapulted my career over the last few years, to where I haven't been shy about being that advocate for Elevate as a chief diversity officer, and being an advocate even for the city of Fort Worth to become a more diverse city and to show itself as being a more diverse city, so that we can invite people in and take advantage of the talent that's out there, because we have so much more that we can do and the potential is there.
I was one of the highlights of my career. We actually had an incredibly passionate, hardworking, and diverse team, and the respect that we all had for one another was incredible.
It was.
But somebody asked me just last week what was one of the highlights of my career, and it wasn't a product launch, and it wasn't a deal. It was when our small team started to grow,
Yeah.
and somebody knocked on my door, my office door, and I waved them in. She came in and she said, "You have a minute? I want to find out how I can join your team." And it was the culture of the team that we built, right? It was
Yeah.
absolutely an infectious culture,
Yeah.
and other people from other groups wanted to come work there,
Yeah.
and that was my proudest moment. And
I
I
agree.
absolutely love that. So, with that, I want to thank you. This was an amazing conversation. I've learned a lot about DEI. I've learned a lot about you. We've known each other for 7 years, and I still learn more about you uh, every time we talk. Your passion truly shines through in every conversation, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being my first guest here.
Well, thank you for having me, Jason. It's a pleasure, and congratulations on your success with this. Looking forward
Thank you.
to learning some more from all the other guests that you have on there.
Thanks so much. Well, that was an absolutely amazing conversation with the esteemed Dion Harrison, and I want to thank Dion again for being our first guest. That was an incredible conversation, and I'm just so privileged to have been able to have him as our first guest, since we've worked together a few times. He's a dear friend, and he is truly a triple threat leader who embodies all of the values that we want in a leader. So, as you'll see in each of our episodes, we're going to conclude with just a quick recap of the key points that we learned from our guest. And today, I really took away 4 different points. Number 1, don't be shy about who you are. Be your authentic self in your community and at work. Number 2, learn something new from the people around you. We all have the opportunity to work with people of different cultures, different backgrounds, often different geographies, and learn something new from them and make it part of your culture and of your life. As Dion mentioned, and I've seen it, it's pretty remarkable. He and his family celebrate holidays from all different cultures and backgrounds and religions, and they bring that home. They bring that into their home. They do that with their daughter, and it's an amazing thing to see. The third key point that I learned from Dion is that DEI is even more important and more relevant now that we are in a virtual world. Why is that? It's because we're hiring people to work for our companies, and we work with people from different cultures, different geographies, and even though we're virtual, it actually creates a bigger opportunity for us to learn from others. And that the burden, though, is on us and on DEI organizations and leaders to bring that into our communities and to bring that to the employees through virtual media. So where you might have had DEI events in the past that were in person, you need to move those online so that everyone can participate and we can learn from one another. And the last, which is really more of a triple threat leadership trait, not as relevant to DEI, but actually certainly could be, but certainly a triple threat leadership trait. And I'm glad Dion brought it up, is make every deal equitable. This is an important point in leadership and in management. You want to make sure that both parties, when making a deal, walk away feeling positive about that deal. You don't want any one party feeling that they were strong-armed, and you certainly don't want to leave a deal feeling that you were shortchanged. So go in with the mentality when you're negotiating anything that you want both parties to feel good about the outcome. So with that, we come to the end of our very first episode. I want to thank you all for listening and watching. It's been really exciting for me to bring this out to everybody, and I'm looking forward to interviewing new triple threat guests every 2 weeks. Thank you for listening to the Leader's Perspective podcast, and as always, have a great day and be your best self.
Thanks for listening to the Leader's Perspective podcast, brought to you by Accel Advisors. Visit accel-advisors.com for more information about our growth, turnaround, optimization, risk, and HR advisory services.
The Leader's Perspective is produced by Accel Advisors, LLC,
and is available on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify.